context for my talk was something that I did last year for another Igbo conference in Nigeria. And the context for that was looking at how to leverage the power of the media, entertainment, education, and technology for changing Igbo paradigms and future realities. So that's the context of what you're about to hear. It does fit in with what we're talking about today, because what I tried to do was to look at issues of history, myth, and reinvention, and to tell three stories, really, which explore identity formation, identity protection, and identity projection over 3,000 years. So that's kind of what you're going to hear. So we'll start with the first 1,000 years, which is AD 1015, and it's the story of Enri and the face of Enri. Odiegu, Enri thought quietly to himself as he looked at the sun, the giver of life, whose rays scarred his face in praise. Enri always liked the word Odiegu and its dual meaning of expressing a kind of charged wonderment alongside fear. The word accurately described the great enchantments of the sun and following its disappearance over the horizon, the nighttime void of space sparkling with a million stars. Enri ruminated further on the power and poetry of the Igbo language and how it so readily enabled a man to capture the essence of things. Here he was at an important moment in the evolution of both the language and the people. All seemed to rest on him. His father, Enri, had initiated the transition from foraging in the dense forests to farming and establishing settled communities. The crops that they had been able to domesticate, from yams, cocoyams, bread, fruit, and palm trees, had given his family a prominence among the affairs of their initial peer group. Then their exploits and influence had spread to more distant groups of foragers as others settled down and formed villages. All these people, numbering thousands, now saw his father as their culture hero. The musicians and their song stories spread his family's fame further, which he knew would enable his deification. In time, him and his lineage would have a religion built around their great technological feat of crop domestication. His father, Enri, hadn't kept the secret of domestication to himself, even though this was the source of his growing power and the legitimization of his lineage. To truly keep this power, he understood that he needed to give it away. As his descendant, Enri also recognized that this innovation would have meant little without technology and the tools to work the bountiful land. Thankfully, these had been produced in a symbiotic relationship with the great family of smiths and artists at Oka. But for now, Enri was deeply troubled by his current problems. Where would he get the additional resources to complete his great project? The project was his attempt to ensure that he would be remembered. He knew the way to do this was to get the bronze workers to cast an image of him that would last forever. The works would constitute the first portrait of an Igbo person. It would embody a real likeness beyond the abstractions and limitations of wooden masks, an imagined Igbo person, a man of bronze living outside time. As much as he loved his fellow Igbo, he knew he would be the only one to do this and to expend the necessary resources to enable it. The rest of the titled men around him and men of means were spending their money on the usual frivolous things: title-taking, burials, feasts, and wives. Great creative men of energy die, and 10 years later, Enri thought, it's as though they never live, because nothing of substance has been left. All that remains is their descendants scrambling over their possessions. In every generation, the fragility of the culture and the civilization is exposed. He had been given the honorific Eze Enri, and he would insist that the title would mean something. It was nearly midday, the sun would be at its highest and scorching, and the hardworking men and women would be at the farms. It would be around this time that the lame boy, Ihechi, would come to bother him, asking interminable questions. There was something about the boy that led him to preserve his life, despite the absurd belief, surely a hangover from the days in the forest, that if your body was not perfect, then you threatened to pollute the land, and were killed as a result. He had gone to great lengths to protect the boy, even at the risk of his own reputation. Ah, here comes the boy now. Mazi, a quiet voice, said by way of respectful greeting. Iheshi sat down and drew up his lame leg. The old man watched him and wondered which question would come today. During his nighttime conversations with the other titled gentlemen, the insights garnished with proverbs which emerged were sometimes so profound it made Enri heady. He was always frustrated that such powerful insights into the workings of the world vanished by the morning, leaving him puzzled about a means to capture them. He began to use the boy and his questions as a way of rehearsing for these late encounters with the titled men. The boy looked at him, and he knew the first question was coming. He had that look in his eyes. He had probably woken up the night before and been challenged by an existential question and wanted an answer. The boy cleared his throat. Here it came, the question. How do we know we are Igbo? He thought about the answer. His practice was never to reply immediately, but to think about the idea and take his time before the answer came. He chewed his kola nut from the night before and winced a little at the bitter taste. In his head, he knew elements of the answer to the boy's question. It is obvious that the Igbo are the people who think themselves Igbo, and he and his family had been a huge part of getting that to happen. 1,000 years ago, the people here were living like beasts in the forest, and even more recently, when the bulk of them had turned to agriculture and producing a surplus, which had enabled a degree of luxury, sophisticated knowledge, and high material culture, there remained other Igbo-speaking peoples on the border who, for whatever reason, did not accept that they were Igbo. Today, when long-distance traders pass through these Igbo-speaking communities, they are treated as hostile strangers. Enri's lineage and his allies, the Smiths and medicine men, the Dibia, were the only ones able to walk through these Igbo-speaking areas, passing through all the different clans, because of their ritual role in counting the months in anticipation of the first rains for planting. Enri knew exactly what he would tell the boy. Some think that Igbo-ness is about the clothes we wear, but 500 years ago, Igbos did not dress as we do today. So it's not the clothes that make us Igbo. Similarly, those Igbos that did not worship exactly the way that we do today, we know the sun and the land are the powers. Then they worship women and the moon. So it's not religion, although the religion is very important. The language must be important because we're named after the language, and the language carries our spirit. But I would say that even the people who were here before us, who did not dress like us or worship the way we do, or even speak this language as we speak it today, nevertheless, are we not their children? So it must be more than the language. He stopped and looked at the boy and then threw the question back at him. How do we know we are Igbo? The boy held his gaze. He didn't panic or mumble a word. Enri thought a while, then continued. We know we are Igbo because we do Igbo. The elders disagree about the etymology and the origins of the word. Some believe it meant forest people. Some disagree and say it means slave people. And others say it meant not so much slaves, but unsophisticated bush people who lived and foraged in the bush. Finally, others say it means the community and of people. Me and my family, we accepted the challenge of the first three definitions that people threw out, but we enact and do the community definition. Igbo-ness is a combination of blood and the things a community creates as it adapts to its environment and tamed this great forest around us. It is an idea of progress within community. People here laugh at me about why I use up so many resources to create these objects, the portraits, the vases, getting the Smiths to deploy the best technology available to develop new ways of working bronze to achieve these results. My answer is people are ideas, and my aim is to make this idea, this community, concrete through the telling of its story. I even bought glass beads from the traders in the far north, and they told us that in their travels they went to lands where people had built bigger structures and where they had objects which speak back at them through their mouths, and which they call books, and which they say contains the words of the Creator. I know that without these concrete manifestations of who we are, in the future these people with their books will come here and when they come here and meet nothing, we will collapse, especially given our openness to change and pragmatism and power around us. Let us think it so that we can do it, so that we can marvel and contemplate at what we have done, before, of course, we begin the cycle again. Enri had gone on for a while. He could see that much of what he was saying was going over the head of the boy, but he had a good opening for the discussions tonight with the titled elders, the concept of change and continuity. He thought again about the important need for a way of capturing and codifying these profound thoughts that he felt were being birthed for the first time. He sometimes imagined that he could give himself the title of seer and put white chalk around his eyes, like the powerful Dibias he employed. But he sometimes had doubts about his own thoughts and whether they were really as revolutionary as he thought, or it was just that it had never been written down before. As he looked up and saw the orb of the sun, the sun beginning to fall on its regular journey, he wondered whether there was truly anything new under it. Looking at the boy now, he also wondered, indeed, whether all of this was above his head, or whether he would be the visionary who would combine the surplus of the farmers, the healing power of the Dibias, the technology and instruments fashioned by the smiths, and the new goods and ideas brought in by the long-distance travelers and traders to create a civilization that would become world-renowned. As he watched the boy and thought the thought, he knew he was letting sentiment get in the way. He was being slightly ridiculous because his people would not allow the lame boy to lead them, even if he was the visionary. He also knew that their capacity for instant pleasure and their lack of community would make their civilization constantly fragile, waiting to be swept away by forgetfulness and a lack of memory. However, he remained hopeful. Their relationship to the land, the Great Mother, would bind them together. They would own it together, and her rules and taboos would become their constitution, or menala. He laughed at the paradox that despite the religious innovation of sun worship, the Igbo remained at heart, after all, women worshippers. Nothing new ever under the sun. And then we go forward 1,000 years to the lamentation of Oboa. Mamanu, Oboa was anxious. Speaking in front of the community was a challenge. The fear of ridicule was always present. She was afraid of somebody having better proverbs or using the poetry of the language to undermine the other speakers that they didn't agree with. Oboa was also worried because as a woman, it was still unusual for her to be allowed to address the Oha, the people as a gathered community. Even now that she was nearing 100 and had been, for the last 25 years, allowed to speak at these gatherings through taking her very expensive chieftaincy title, she still found it odd. She didn't know why she felt this way. Her mother had raised her not to be fearful of men, or even the ancestral masquerades. Her mother had been an extraordinary woman, a warrior who had taken on the might of an empire when the men had been defeated and cowed a generation earlier. She remembered as a 10-year-old the quarrels between her mother and father when they were complaining about the British and their new tax demands placed on people's huts. Her father and the Umunna had endless meetings about how to confront the British, but each time the men had backed down, saying, "Remember how they had destroyed us with their guns? They are too powerful. We should just go along with this. Besides, many of our children have now gone into their schools where they are learning about the power of the whites, and we don't want to jeopardize that." They argued that if they rose up with the rest of the country in the north and the west, rise up with them, or would they be sacrificed? And the answer was no. So why risk making the British unhappy in a war that we could not win? Her mother had been furious at this attitude. She had taunted her father that there were not many British around, that the people who were imposing these draconian orders were not even the British. They were fellow Nigerians, especially the Igbo warrant chiefs, a group of ne'er-do-wells who were imposed over traditional Igbo society, who were soaked in corruption, and who would not allow anything without a bribe. Her mother had insisted that organization and a moral campaign could reverse the British order. Just because you have been defeated does not mean you have to accept the status of a slave. 4 years later, the women rose against the British in Aba and towns across southern Nigeria as far as Calabar. Some of them stripped naked in their fury and symbolically demonstrated the extent of their humiliation. The women's war was a different kind of war without guns or violence. As a child, Obiocha had been amazed at how much force moral authority could have. It had won them many concessions from the British. The hut tax had been modified, and shortly after, a commission was set up to overhaul the warrant chief system. Obiocha looked at the village assembly waiting for her to talk. The title leaders were there in their red caps. She wanted that spirit of her mothers to be here again, given the challenges now facing the community again. Yes, in her lifetime, the country had got independence. The British had gone. And then her Igbo people had faced another devastating defeat when the political problems blew up in the 1960s. As a 50-year-old, she knew the causes of the Biafra War were complicated, but as a mother, she was angry and nearly broken by having to bury 3 of her 4 children. Her eldest son had been killed fighting at Abagana, and another in Umahia, and the other one had been murdered before the war in the northern part of the country. At the end of the war, Obiocha wondered what the fight was about. What was this freedom that her mother had gone to such lengths to animate? And then 30 years later, she again had seen her people fight so intensely, passionately, and recklessly for. What was it for? Obiocha had been standing in the middle of the assembled people for what seemed an eternity. The gathered women now were getting restless, and some were beginning to wonder, would this woman ever talk? And some of the elders were already against women being given titles and speaking in the forum. And were looking at her and at each other, and their eyes were saying, you see, this is why we shouldn't have them in the meetings. Obiocha held her ground and decided she would use the opportunity to deliver a sermon to the gathered throng. They knew why she was here. At her advanced age, she had buried yet another child, the victim of a kidnapping. And then at her son's funeral, she had been shocked at the behavior of people, the demands for money, the fighting over land. Perhaps these fights were so intense because communal land and the bonds holding people together were fraying, and people were increasingly going their own way, selling and privatizing land. Perhaps funerals were the last communal expressions of solidarity and connectedness, and in them we see and witness the fracturing of the land. Obiocha knew that she would have to speak to this. She began, I'm just a woman, and we're not supposed to have sense. But I look around me today and I get no sense from what is going on in the land. As one of our great prophets has said, if we want to understand what has happened to us, we need to examine when the rain started to beat us. For hundreds of years, we traded with the whites, capturing each other and selling some of our best people, the lame ones, the Ohu slaves, the weak, the innocent. We even sold them through some of our religious centers. What a desecration. And then we complained when the people we were selling them to became stronger and attacked us here in our own homeland. We began to think we were victims. The victims of what? Our greed, stupidness, or wickedness? Anyway, after the whites attacked us here in our homeland, we realized that we had to fight back for our culture and our freedom again, and we fought hard, perhaps because we wanted to correct the mistakes we had made. But we lost that battle on the control over our institutions. Soon across the land, the things we had spent 1,000 years building were of no more value. To be considered educated was not to speak your own tongue. You could no longer communicate with your creator who made your ancestors in its image. You could now only do this through the ancestors of others who you communicate in different languages. We've been seeking redemption in the wrong place, looking for light. Meanwhile, our past has become darkness. The light now only seems possible through the prism of other people's past. I was raised a Christian, but is Moses not somebody's ancestor? Is Joseph not the same? Who are the great Igbo men and women of the last 1,000 years? How do we teach our children who they are? We've been called Igbo, Igbo. Even some want us to rename us now, Nyemiri. Tufiaka, are we water beggars? No, we are 30 million strong, one of the great peoples of this continent. And you do not produce that many people by not having great men and women. My own mother fought in the Aba Women's War, but who teaches anything about her? Where have all these people who say they know book? But what is it that they really know? We have urban planners, and yet look at Aba, look at Onitsha. Brilliant lawyers, but lawlessness. I have never left Igbo land, but many of you have. They say we travel to the ends of the earth. Some of you have seen the best cities of the world. But why is Enugu literally the city on a hill, not a great African city? So that people can come here to trade and do business as you do when you go to trade and invest in other people's lands. I'm an old woman. I played my part. My father fought the Europeans. My mother fought the Europeans. I gave 3 of my children for an idea about freedom. When I look at the state of our cities, see the young people without any jobs, see the politicians, many corrupt like the Warren chiefs of old, I wonder what all this sacrifice was about. What is the learning? Some say Igbo means community of people. Community is not a bush or slave people. Our great ancestor Enri thought that we were more than this, and he and his family and their allies gave us the basis for civilization. He knew there was a primordial tension between the bush and Igbo civilization, and that Igbo would pull back and forth between these two ideas. But he also knew there was a third idea about the Igbo, the idea of slavery. People who are in and others who are out. The core Igbo, Amadi, and the outsiders, those without land. The weak, the Ohu, those sold abroad. One of the Enris in the 18th century denounced slavery, but we did not listen to him. The Jews stopped selling each other after the lesson of Joseph and treat each other as equals. But despite the Enri's warning in the 18th century, we continued. Slavery did not stop here until 60 years ago, when I was an adult woman. I'm an old woman now, but I speak to the young ones. You are now the pivot generation. You have to remake this community, and this community is now across the world, so it's a new challenge, but we have the means. When I talk to my grandchildren in America and my great-grandchildren, they tell me about these Nollywood films, but these films seem to be only about fear and wickedness with no vision for well-made communities. If we no longer think it, how can we do it, and how can we contemplate what we have done? When the British came here, they brought their language, their religion, their culture, cultural infrastructure, their business for one purpose. Today, their language, technology, and values rule the world. But we cannot describe a modern scientific thought in our language. This is a fundamental requisite for serious communities in the world, so modern ideas can slow down to people in the village. Our redemption is not abstract. It is about reconciling our past, admitting our mistakes, and offering apologies to those we have harmed, our ancestors, and to ourselves. My great-grandchildren tell me stories of Igbo landing in America. What happened to those Igbo people we sold abroad hundreds of years ago? If we want them to reconnect to us, what do we offer them? One of my grandchildren, he likes a music he calls jazz, and he heard a song called Igbo-ness. Why is this black American jazz musician talking about Igbo-ness, and what does it mean today? Ndekani Odiego, Mamunu. Obiocha sat down after her lamentation. The words that she spoke had been troubling her for years. She finally decided that there was nothing anybody could do to her any longer, and it was now between her and her creator. I'm running out of time because I didn't time it for this session, but the third story is 1,000 years in the future, and it's the Igbo Chronicles.